Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Jeff Stratford. Welcome to Biostats, not Biostats, Biostats, Bio 347. So we're going to start our first lecture talking about the big picture. And so before we even get into statistics per se, let's take a step back and just talk about science in general, and then we'll see how statistics fits within science, both as a science and how it's used for science. So just to give some terms, epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we get new knowledge, the forms of knowledge. Within there, we have inference. So science is all about making inferences, okay? And usually what inferences are is these are logical conclusions, okay? So we may not be able directly to see something, but what we like to do is be able to say something about it. So if you drop something, you assume that gravity's at work. We don't see gravity at work, but we can assume and infer that gravity's at work. But I'll come up with more examples as we go along. There are two forms of inference. One is induction, and the other is deduction. Okay. Induction is where you come up with specific cases. So specific cases, and it leads us to generalize. Deduction is the opposite. That's where we have a generalization, and that leads us to make specific hypotheses or predictions, okay? And we'll just call it specifics. All right, example of induction. Let's take Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA. Okay. So this is a double helix because it's two strands that form a helical pattern. So it's a double helix. So they just didn't discover this by itself. What they discovered was that had a sugar phosphate backbone, and that you had bases on the inside, and these were bound to each other through hydrogen bonds, and where you had an A, you have a T and a C, and a G, and so on, right? So it wasn't just a double helix, it was the details, right? The structure of DNA. So it was this backbone, bases in the center, and then the whole thing twists, right? So how did they get there, since they didn't actually see this, right? Not directly, okay? So one is Chargaff's rule. I'll just call it CR. So that is, for A, there's a T, for every C, there's a G, and so on. Okay, so they knew that, Chargaff's rule. They also knew that there was deoxyribose, okay, the sugar. They knew there were phosphates, and they knew they had a double helix. Okay, Remember, they knew it was a double helix from the work of Rosalind Franklin. So Rosalind Franklin, working with them, showed it was a double helix. So that was a big chunk of the puzzle. But the other parts were how the double helix was actually the substructure of those, right? What's the backbone made out of? How are the bases arranged? And what they did was they put all this together and came up with the double helix. So they're able to generalize and say all DNA is made up like this. So they took specific things, put it together, and came up with a great case of induction. All right. Deduction is when you take generalizations and make specific predictions. So, for example, if all living things are made of cells, then even if I couldn't see bacteria, what could I infer about the makeup of bacteria? That it would have a cellular structure, okay? Not multicellular, but at least a cellular structure. So you take a generalization and you can say specific things, right? So you can pick any taxa and say those organisms are made up of cells because that's just part of the deductive framework. Let's see, what's next? The next thing, so let's clear. Let's talk about hypotheses. Okay. A hypothesis is an explanation. So let's call it an explanation. And it's relatively narrow. Okay. And what I mean by that is it's for a certain set of cases you can actually observe. Okay. We'll get into examples. And let's say it's often invisible. I'm going to put that in quotes because I don't mean it's there, but you can't see it. What I mean is, let's take an example. Let's say you think testosterone modulates aggressive behavior in birds. That's your hypothesis. And we can even pick a bird like song sparrows. I watch song sparrows in my backyard. They're actually smaller than house sparrows, but if you watch them, it looks like certain individual house sparrows will actually, song sparrows will actually boot out the larger house sparrows from good feeding spots. So the question is it testosterone that modulates this? I don't know, but that's my hypothesis right now. So what I don't see, and this is why I say it's invisible, for me to see this, for it to be visible, I'd have to see the testosterone molecule working in such a way that I could see the molecule going to the neurons and activating neurons, if it acts directly like that. Okay. You think some drug has some activity on an animal's physiology, right? You are not proposing that you can actually see those molecules at work. That's what I mean by invisible. So oftentimes we don't see these things, but we suspect they're at work. And even you can take it at the macro scale, we still won't see them. You could say that in a population of endangered fish, that it's birth rates that determine the population level, not death rates of adults, right? So you're not actually seeing that play out on every individual. You can mark some, and you can measure the how many eggs they have. You'll have to do the calculations, but you don't actually see those dynamics playing out in front of you. Okay? You can only sample some fish and then make inferences about the population. And you don't see fish dying, right? You may see a dead fish, but you don't see it overall affecting the population, all those fish playing out. So when I say hypotheses are these invisible mechanisms, that's what I mean. Is we're not directly observing them, but they're the things that are the cause and effect. All right. A theory A theory is not a confirmed hypothesis. Some people may define it that way. That's fine. This is not how I define it. I define a theory as it's a generalized explanation. So it's an explanation but it's general. Let's say generalized. Okay, think of some theories, okay? Cell theory. Cell theory, there are 5 elements to cell theory. All cells are made up of living cells. Cells come from other cells. Basic unit of life is a cell. So there's a couple different things, but applies to all of life. The theory of evolution by natural selection, okay, which applies to all living organisms. Okay. So theories are very broad, where hypotheses are very narrow, right? It's not a matter of how well something is confirmed or not, or the evidence for something or not. That's a totally different thing. All right. What you can have are what I would call robust hypotheses and robust theories. Okay, so robust hypotheses and theories are those that have good evidence for them. So, for example, if I figured out ways to test that aggressive behavior in song sparrows is determined by testosterone, and I test that using various methods, I would say that's a relatively robust hypothesis because it fits lots of data. A robust theory means it's a generalized explanation that has supports from various fields because it is generalized. So the theory of natural selection, or the theory of evolution via natural selection, has evidence from various fields, right? From genetics to paleontology, etc. Right? That's what makes it robust, right? All right. We test our hypotheses using predictions. Okay, so it might be good. Let me clear the screen here. So let's contrast hypotheses and predictions. Okay, these two things work together, and I'll show you how they're linked. Now remember that a hypothesis is like a mechanism. It's the thing that's causing something to happen, right? Testosterone is driving aggressive behavior in song sparrows, right? A prediction, right, is what you actually observe. Like I said, we can't see hormones acting directly. We could on a different level, but at the behavioral level, we cannot see these things acting out. A prediction is the things we observe. So what can we observe? So these are observable. So unlike hypotheses that are invisible, predictions are the observable. These are the things that are measured. Okay? These things are linked this way through if-then statements. So if testosterone leads to, we'll say, aggression, then, right, if we block testosterone, be fewer aggressive behaviors. Okay, and likewise, if we increase it, so if testosterone drives aggression, if we block it, we'll have fewer aggressive behaviors. And if we increase it, we can expect more aggressive behaviors. And if we say an aggressive behavior is when a song sparrow gets close to a house sparrow, there's some sort of interaction, right? So if the house sparrow drives the song sparrow out, then its aggressive behaviors decrease. But if a song sparrow drives out a house sparrow, then we can say that the song sparrow is more aggressive. So we can measure those things, right? So then the prediction is what you observe. The hypothesis is what drives it. It's a mechanism behind it. All right. So getting back to theories. Give you another term, a paradigm. So a paradigm is, it's a theory that's just accepted. So it's just a theory that is accepted as true. And I'm going to say not true with a capital T. So it's just things we just think, well, this is how the world works. So we think evolution's true to the point that nobody is testing evolution anymore. Would it make sense to go out and see if an animal evolves, because we did that over 100 years ago, and you know, we make lots of hypotheses and predictions, and so far it holds up the theory, and it's just, say, like a super robust theory. Okay. All right, so let's clear this. So the way that I see science working is you have some theory, right? And so Darwin comes up with the theory of evolution through natural selection. And so a bunch of people immediately run out and start testing it. Okay, so they come up with all these hypotheses. And what I want you to know is, for every hypothesis, there's several ways to test it. Okay, so when I said that testosterone increases or decreases aggressive behaviors in song sparrows, there's several ways to test that. We can add testosterone, we could subtract testosterone, we can add receptor blockers. So we can block the action of testosterone. So we don't reduce the amount, we just reduce the number of receptors, molecular receptors for testosterone, and see how that works. But for every hypothesis, there's several ways to test it. That's an important thing. Okay. So for something like a theory, we produce many, many hypotheses. And then for each hypothesis, you're going to have many predictions. Okay. And a way to test each prediction is you're going to come up with some experiment. Okay. So all these things, I'm skipping a prediction there. I think you get the point. For every prediction, we can test it, right? And that's how we evaluate our hypotheses, is by evaluating our prediction. Okay? And then what you'll find is some experiments don't turn out entirely consistent with your theory. So what you do is you reflect back on your theory, and we'll merge these together, right? And so you'll put this stuff together and reflect upon your theory, and perhaps you have to modify your theory. So what we have is the cycle, right? And any theory has the cycle of deduction, and then induction. Okay. So what I mean by that is a theory, because it's very general, can create lots of hypotheses. That's using deductive logic. So if this theory is true, this creates this hypothesis. And then we evaluate our hypotheses by testing those predictions with experiments or observations. And the way they turn out, we'll put all those results together in induction and create a theory, right? Most of our day-to-day science work at any university is doing this sort of deductive hypothesis testing here. This work, where we look at the field, so this work we're going to call this the day-to-day. And this produces the incredible volumes. Every day, thousands and thousands of papers are accepted. And if you're trying to keep up with the literature, the scientific literature, it's very, very difficult because so many people are out there doing research, right? The way that we kind of evaluate a field is that we look at all these results, we put them together, and we help evaluate some theories, right? So this is this inductive part you'll see in reviews, right? And sometimes we call these critical reviews, but most of the time just reviews. And what they'll do is they'll scan. So imagine each one of these is a publication. They'll scan the published works and say, this is where this field's heading. These experiments didn't work out, these have. And so this is what we're going to say about the theory. And so we think the brains are back here, but the reality of it is it takes a lot of work to scan the literature and understand, to reflect upon all those hundreds of papers that are published in a particular field, to take all those hundreds of papers and then say, this is how it affects our field. And they can be very powerful, and they're among the most highly cited papers in a field, will be the review papers, as well as, not all of these are weighed equally. If you have a particular hypothesis, prediction, and then some very telling experiment, these can be very important as well, right? But a lot of times it's the inductive work. In fact, our great leaps of science have all been inductive work. So we know all the theories because they're so interesting, right? Not all of them have worked out. Aristotle thought the brain helped cool the blood, right? That didn't work out so well. We don't talk about that anymore. But induction is really how a field moves forward, right? But you won't be able to reflect upon a field unless you had experiments to look back on. So it's one of these things where it all belongs together. And as this, I think about a wheel as the progress of science moving forward. All right, we do get paradigm shifts. What's a paradigm shift? Well, it's when you take two dimes and move them. No. A paradigm shift is when we take a paradigm and it moves. Very rarely do you just take a paradigm and throw it out the window and replace it with a totally new paradigm. You have to go way back to where we believe, we had a Earth-centered solar system. And when that was replaced with a sun-centered solar system, that was quite the paradigm shift. But paradigm shifts do occur. There's two that I can think of. One is if you look at Newton's laws of motion, what you find is Newton came up with his laws of motion, but then Einstein came along and he didn't replace it, but what he showed was Newton's laws don't explain these other things, and those other things are like when things are moving at the speed of light, right? That weird things happen. So time's not a constant, mass is a constant, all those really strange things. They're not explained by Newtonian physics. In ecology, back in the 70s and early 80s, everybody thought competition and rules, right? Structured communities. And what I mean by that was plants were all trying to live in a community, and the superior ones booted out the weaker ones or the less fit ones. And there were certain rules. So you could only be in a community if you played by the certain rules. So you had a certain body size relative to other species like you, right? You couldn't be too close to them. And what they've shown is that that's partially true. So we haven't replaced it, but that's partially true. And what we've added to that in the bigger picture is so much of a community is just random, right? So the trees you see in a particular forest, it's just a random set of trees from a regional population, right? That it's not a competition thing. There's no rules, right? That a lot of it's random, and a lot of it could be just like how many of you were you in the larger area kind of determines how many are you in a smaller area. So there's no competitive thing other than just a numerical advantage. So we do see paradigm shifts. And like I said, very rarely do you see one paradigm replace another one. Usually it's just one gets swallowed by a newer one. All right. Next, all right. How do we do science and Francis Bacon. In the 17th century, he really laid out this idea of having what we call testing alternative hypotheses. Okay, where you think something's at work, but what you should do is list them, right? Think of all the plausible ideas, and then you start testing them to see if they're working. And the one that remains should be the hypothesis you stick with, okay? Another idea was proposed by T.C. Chamberlain in 1890. And his idea was multiple working hypotheses. And what he did, so instead of just saying this hypothesis is not true, what he proposed is that in a way, all of them could be true, but we can rank them. Okay, where the first hypothesis works better than the third hypothesis works better than the second hypothesis. But all of these could be potentially correct. It's just that one hypothesis works better than the others. Okay? So for example, if you said, what determines human longevity, you might say smoking, diet, genetics, and it ends up, you can't really cross out any of those things, but really one thing may determine human longevity longer than the others. Okay. All right. Statistics. Now let's get into statistics a little bit. Statistics is both a science and a tool of science. Okay. What do I mean by that? Genetics. There's a field of genetics, which is a field unto itself. Right? The structure of genes, structure of DNA, how do these things interact? How is development affected by the environment in relation to the genes? Also, genetics can be used as a tool. So we can look at things like relatedness among individuals using genetics. Okay, so statistics is a science, which means in and of itself, statistics is a field of study, right? And we also use statistics as a tool, which implies that as the science changes, so do the tools. So the way they did sequencing back in the 80s is not the way they did sequencing now, right? As a field of genetics. So you would never do the type of sequencing, thank God, that if you wanted to do 100 bases would cost you hundreds of dollars and take several weeks. Now you can, for $7, $8, you can get tens of thousands of base pairs. It's really cheap. I mean, you can, for $30, you can get your genome sequenced. It's pretty crazy. So statistics itself has been changing, and will change in the future. Okay. So statistics we use to inform our beliefs. Okay. And we need statistics for, that's using a tool when you have probabilistic outcomes. Okay, probabilistic outcomes. And what I mean by that is if there's room for uncertainty, then it falls within the field of statistics. Okay, so a lot of times you don't need statistics. Okay, so for example, you want to know if a gene has certain effect. It either does or it doesn't. Okay, if you want to know if say, for example, you want to know if some fertilizer works on a field, right? A typical outcome may look like this. Oops, not the prettiest drawing here. You have a control group, and you have plus fertilizer, and you get, we'll say this is the median, do box and whisker plots, right? You may get something like this, where it looks like the plus fertilizer actually decreased growth. That's because I drew it like this. But notice that some of these here, right, are actually didn't grow as quickly as these things here, right? So given that uniform distribution here, right, we just don't have one response. That we get this distribution of responses, we actually have to use statistics to determine if those things, if this is a statistically significant result or not. All right. Okay, proof. Don't use it. There are several reasons why we don't say we prove things. We use math to prove things. So what I mean is there are mathematical proofs, but we don't prove things in science, right? We can be exceedingly confident of our results, but they don't necessarily prove things. All right, but we do have facts. So what is the difference? If you have facts, why don't we prove things? Well, facts are just observations, okay? So the sun is the center of our solar system. So we can observe that, right? We can make the right observations and determine that we are going around the sun and not the opposite. Okay, so those are facts, things we can observe. Laws. Okay. Laws are an interesting thing. These are a holdover from sort of a religious time when the deists ruled the day, and the deists are, it's a belief where there's a divinity at work, but not directly in the lives of nature and of humans, but rather it's like a watchmaker where the rules are created and then we figure out the rules. Us humans figure out the rules. So I can't think of the last law that's come up, but just let's think of, you have Mendel, right? Mendel's laws. You have, I think we have Boyle, right? There are gas laws. There's got to be a bunch of chemistry laws. Oh, Newton, of course. And even Darwin. Okay. Even though Darwin never came up with a law, if you read the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, it says there's got to be some law that's at work here when we look at that tangled bank of creatures. How did they get here? Why do they look like they do? How do they have those interactions? It's got to be some law, right? All these other laws as well, they thought they always existed. It was just we had to go out and discover them. Most laws today are just mathematical abstractions. And what I mean by that is we can look at Newton's law, we can look at the ideal gas law, right? And we could write a formula. And the works of nature fit those laws, right? For Newton, it's limited when things aren't moving near the speed of light. Start moving near the speed of light, Newton's laws actually don't work altogether too well, right? So, so laws are not something we really do today. If we find generalizations, they'll come up with nice names, but we don't generally name them whoever law. Okay, usually it's just the, we would call it the the mechanism of inheritance or whatever. Okay, we just don't call them laws anymore. Actually, I'd be interested to know when the last law was created that we use. Ohm's law? I don't think it was Ohm's law. All right, so that's the end of our chapter. And I'll wrap this up. And if you have any questions, please send me an email and I'd be happy to answer it.